inequality and environmental degradation. It has been discredited and only rescued from collapse by the greatest state intervention in history. The great twins of neoconservatism and neoliberalism have been tried and tested to destruction. For 30 years, the West elites insisted that only deregulated markets, privatisation and low taxes on the wealthy could deliver growth and prosperity. Neoliberalism was handing power to unaccountable banks and corporations, fuelling poverty and social injustice, while all the time undermining democracy. Surely we need to reconstruct our damaged economy and our damaged society in a more democratic, egalitarian and rational way. A sustainable alternative that will prioritise the concerns of the ordinary people is possible. There is an alternative.
Thank you, Deputy. Deputy Clare Daly.
Thanks, Ceann Comhairle. And really, listening to the previous Labour Party deputies, I was torn between wanting to laugh or cry, and I really think that they doth celebrate too much and try hard to convince themselves that they have reached some sort of a great achievement. I mean, that Irish Nationwide were responsible for Tom McFeely and Priory Hall now is really the last straw, to be honest. Meanwhile, for real people out there in the real world, I think all of us know that citizens across this state are really worried. They were deeply concerned at the antics that went on in this House in the late nights of the evening last week, which really smacked of the bad old days of deals in the middle of the night, lack of information, lack of democracy, and then the best of spin tried to be put on a ridiculous situation after that. And you see, it doesn't really matter what way you dress it up. The reality is that what this government has done in flying in the face of everything he contested the election on was take the bad debts, the bad bank deal, a very undemocratic promissory note situation, and enshrine that as a sovereign debt and foist it on the shoulders of future generations. That's it. That is the burden sharing of the Labour Party, is to share the burden with our children and our future grandchildren and so on, because God forbid that the German, French, English bondholders, institutions and so on might take their cut. Instead, we transfer it onto our people. And to hear people talk that this is responsible for ending Anglo-Irish and Irish nation, that you've seen them off, what an absolute joke. Everybody knows that these banks had effectively closed down years ago. They were being wound down anyway. That was the whole basis for the IBRC in the first place. And I have to say, to listen to Labour deputies shedding crocodile tears for the workers in there is a bit rich, seeing as you were the very ones who voted for the situation that gave rise to these people being made redundant, some of them learning that when they tuned in to Vincent Browne that evening. And I have a letter from a woman in my own constituency who said, as somebody who was employed over the last number of years effectively to wind down Anglo and so on, that she spent the last number of years maximising recovery for the Irish taxpayer. She pointed to the millions that she recovered from various loan books, said she never gained from a large salary or a large bonus in her 12 years at Anglo. She saved for years to participate in the employee share save scheme, which was wiped out in nationalisation, took a preferential staff mortgage in 2006, which is now costing him a fortune for a negative equity property. She's the main earner in her family. Her dwelling is unsuitable for her family needs, and that the last week has been a devastating one for her and her family, not treated with dignity and respect. And similarly, that's the case for other people. Some have been told they won't even be entitled to statutory redundancy, as they've voluntarily made a decision to transfer over to the receiver and continue over the next couple of months. And that's the real face of this. And if workers at the helm in these banks are being treated this way, it's also the case that workers far afield in society are being let down by this deal, because it's not correct, as Deputy Nash said, that we are borrowing to pay our way. the amount of taxation we're raising now basically is enough to keep this economy going. We are borrowing to pay for the national debt and for interest on the national debt, a huge part of which is the private banking burden. And we should say that this deal that you're lauding as a great achievement, already tens of billions of our money has been pumped in to shore up these banks, 20.7 billion from the National Pension Fund. 12 billion sweated off the backs of people in terms of austerity. And you make a great deal about this so-called saving now. But if that was to have any meaning whatsoever, then in reality what you would be doing from this so-called 1 billion saving would be, for example, to eliminate the home tax, free up that money, take money out of people's pockets and allow them to stimulate the economy. Because I think, we should point out that your announcement of this great deal takes place at the same time as the CSO revealed a horrendous figures yesterday for those living in poverty, which has increased substantially over the course of the past year, from up to 16% last year. Those in consistent poverty now at 7%. And your treatment and the Labour Party solution to those people is to put on their shoulders a private debt that had nothing got to do with them in the first place. To me, it's an absolute betrayal. It's not going to be the forerunner for any serious economic recovery, because you've simply decided to use the continuing policies of austerity to bleed people dry. That isn't a way forward, and people will realise that in the very near future.
Thank you, Deputy. And I'll call Deputy Seamus Healy.
Thank you, Cathaoirleach. Cathaoirleach, this debt, of course, is not our debt. It's not the debt of the Irish people. It's a private debt, and that private debt has now been placed on the shoulders of our children and of our grandchildren. The IBRC may be gone, but the debt hasn't gone. And indeed, the debt has been turned into a 64 billion euro debt rather than a 35 billion euro debt. And of course, the government have been claiming that they have saved a significant amount of money in relation to this debt. If that's the case, then I have to put it to the Labour Party, the party who going into the last general election claimed that they were going to look after vulnerable people during the term of this government. They were going to look after middle-income families and families on low income. If that is the case, and if there are millions or billions saved in this deal, then it is incumbent on the Labour Party to use that money to ensure that middle-income earners and low-income families are supported and are protected. For instance, we've had the huge cuts in home helps and home help services, still not reversed, and that is happening on a daily basis. During the course of this deal, Minister Burton, the Deputy Leader of the Labour Party, issued a circular to community welfare officers to stop paying any grants towards religious ceremonies. In other words, to stop paying needy families a few pounds of a grant to look after their children who are having their first communion and their confirmation. And that circular was sent out, Circular 1/2/13. That is an absolute shame and a scandal, and I would call on Minister White to go back to Minister Burton and to get her to reverse that very mean, nasty, shameful cut on very needy families. There's also the question, of course, that there is significant poverty now in this country. As Deputy Daly has said, up over the last number of years, 90,000 children in consistent poverty in this country, 232,000 children living in relative poverty, 733,000 adults, 750,000 of adults at risk of poverty. And we're told that while there's billions to be saved on this deal, not a single halfpenny of it is going to protect the vulnerable, as the Labour Party claimed in the course of the last general election. The Minister for Finance has made great play of comparing this promissory note deal to a home mortgage and the historic reduction of capital repayments through inflation. The lender is, of course, compensated for this inflation effect by vastly increased total interest bill over the longer period paid by the homeowner. But there is a better analogy, and it's like this. This deal is like extending the period of a mortgage, which you are being forced to pay, not on your own home, but on the home of another person, for which you never had and don't have any liability. From the point of view of the Irish people, the point is that the liabilities of the Anglo-Irish Bank and Irish Nationwide were never our debt. That debt was wrongly shouldered onto the Irish people by the previous government, and by doing this deal, the current government has now agreed that this debt is the debt of the Irish people. It has sanctioned the betrayal of the previous government. So much for Eamon Gilmore's accusation of economic treason against Fianna Fáil and the Greens. The government, of course, didn't even seek a formal write-down of debt. And the outcome, therefore, is that the debts of the IBRC are now even more firmly nailed to the state debt than heretofore. Where now are the calls of Fine Gael and Labour for burden sharing? Where now are the calls for separating bank debt from sovereign debt? The deal may give some short-term easing of repayments to the state at the expense of future generations. But this is not our debt. This transfer of debt onto the debts of bondholders onto the shoulders of our children and grandchildren is simply shameful. This easing may not last long. How much more have I left?
9 seconds.
9 seconds.
And falling rapidly.
This easing may not last long because the ECB has the sword of Damocles over this deal. They can ensure, they can direct the central bank to float these bonds and to put them out into the private market, where the interest rate will not be 0.575%, but 3% or more, which would be a huge burden on the Irish people. And of course, they will use that to ensure that the government dances to the tune of austerity and continues the austerity that this government has been pursuing since it came to power.
Thank you, Deputy. I now call on Deputy Maureen O'Sullivan.
Good. Vís a hí an seo an seachtain se caite géisteach leis an tíiseach ar dús agus drééis tamil a géisteach leis an para. Agus vís ag súil go méid rud iontach ag teacht. Go méid rud ag teacht a bheith dearfacht an tíir seo. So sitting here last week, I really wanted to share the good news and to take part in the applause. I wanted to believe that it was good news. And I'm coming to this without any background or any study of economics. So I took to the newspapers to have a look, and certainly the economists appear to have been favourable because some of the headlines were the deal will cut borrowing by 20 billion, ease the next budget. Considerable achievement for the coalition parties. Highly important political achievement. This deal is worth 8 billion to the state, and austerity in the coming years will be less harsh due to the debt deal. And then the fact was that the bond markets did react positively. The national newspapers seem to be favourable, and then the international media seem to be of the same opinion. The New York Times that another important milestone in our slow emergence from the crisis, and a German paper saw it as Ireland winning the argument, a financial and a symbolic importance to Ireland. But, and there is a major but, and it's rather like closing the stable door when the horse is bolted, because that horse should have been kept in the stable in the first place. And by that I mean that the debt should never have been incurred. These billions of euro that went into Anglo and Irish Nationwide. And when I was debating the Magdalen Laundries last week, I saw that as a shameful event in our history. But I think also the signing of that deal back in 2008 was also a very shameful event, committing 35 billion to Anglo-Irish and to Nationwide, and particularly without any agreement by the Irish electorate. And so the Irish nation began this journey on a very rocky road of paying for something that they had no hand actor part in. This process of allowing individuals from various banks and organisations who are now household names to shirk the responsibility for what they did. We accept that those who commit murder, those who go into drug dealing, those who commit robbery or assault will be imprisoned and punished. But anyone can commit an economic crime of gigantic proportions
with catastrophic effects on the country, and nothing happens. Life goes on as usual, business as usual, and if not in Ireland, then in some foreign country where the profits are building up again. And that leads to further inequalities, where these individuals, appearing to have lost considerable wealth, but they're still existing on incredible levels of income and resources. And on the other hand, people making sacrifices, as Minister Howland pointed out this morning, losing their homes, salary cuts, and consequent effects on emotional and mental health. That original agreement was really an affront to democracy. Then, there certainly did not appear to be any confronting or standing up to the ECB, but rather capitulation, because we were told the ATMs would be left without money, people would go without their salaries. But who were we protecting? And it wasn't the Irish nation, it was these very shadowy figures from European banks. And again, it was recklessness and gambling that were rewarded. So the intolerable burden has continued, and we know at what cost to the country with the very harsh budgets. So I know the government was on considerable pressure to secure a deal. I've no doubt the Minister and officials put hours and hours into this, and in the context of what was achieved, considerable, when we are told that a write-down was not available, because the ECB seemingly have never given a write-down to any country in Europe. And Minister Noonan said there was no point making a demand he knew that they were not going to meet, because it would be starting off on the wrong foot. But we're never going to know now. And he obviously doesn't remember that lovely phrase from the New Testament, I think, about ask and you shall receive. We'll never know what would have happened. What was also disquieting was the speed at which things happened last week, and it was reminiscent of another momentous event which had also occurred. So what has been achieved? Something in the short term, basically, but the problem has been shifted to the next generation. And I ask, is that appropriate or is it moral? Because the losses of Anglo-Irish and nationwide are still being borne by the Irish people, and it's an enormous burden on a small nation. We have a workforce of about 1.8 million people with a huge private bank debt. But where's the fair burden sharing with other Eurozone members? And how can we recover our economic sovereignty in these circumstances? And in the meantime, we see the hardship. Am I just finished?
You have 53 seconds.
Okay, right. Okay. Eurostat confirmed that Ireland has paid more than any state to rescue the banks. Some put it that we paid almost 50 times more than any other country. The Nevin Economic Research Institute said Ireland has paid 42% of the total EU bank debt. I know we have a reputation for being a generous country, but it should be for humanitarian reasons, as it has been in the past, not to rescue failed bankers and recklessness. There's other comments that have been made. I really wanted to believe that this was good for Ireland. I wanted to share that elation. But the problems are, number one, the original bank guarantee. It put an intolerable burden on Ireland, and it was based on the premise that no bank should fail, not even Anglo, regardless of the effect of the nation. No bondholder should suffer. The next problem is not asking for or discussing a write-down or some write-down. Just because the ECB were expected to say no, they weren't even asked. The other problem is the lack of fair burden sharing. OK, we have a cheaper debt, but it's a debt we shouldn't have in the first place, and there was no real impact analysis done on that.
Thank you, Deputy. I now call on Minister Alex White, Deputies Liam Toomey, Owen Murphy and Jim Daly, who each have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Cahill.
Minister.
And may I say that I can really not disagree with very much of what Deputy O'Sullivan has just said, with one exception, which is this question that's come up from time to time. Why didn't we ask for a write-down? It might have been available had we just asked. Just examine that just for a minute. You're in negotiations with whoever, or in discussions with the European Central Bank. The Irish Central Bank is with the members of the European Central Bank. The Irish government has to deal with the institutions as well. And we're dealing with a situation where a sovereign promise has been made on behalf of the Irish state, which this government then takes over in 2011 and has to face the realities and the facts that are presented to it. And we discover very clearly that there's what can only be described as a very hard line taken in relation to both the notes and the other commitments entered into on behalf of the Irish sovereign. That there's a negotiation, an attempt to renegotiate these instruments and renegotiate these deals, so-called deals. And we're engaging in that, and we're finding considerable difficulty persuading people to our point of view. But we're nevertheless persisting. And people are saying that in the course of that activity, we should then say, oh, by the way, we want to ask you something else. Would you mind just deleting the entire thing? What? Sorry, we're in negotiation about this, renegotiate. Would you mind just deleting the whole thing, please? We want it all written off. Just examine whether there's any credibility associated with taking such a course of action. In any circumstance, not just in the sovereign debt circumstance. You go to the bank to renegotiate a debt, you go to anybody, you have a debt, and you're seeking to renegotiate and get better terms, and then you say, oh, by the way, before we come back to that, would you mind just writing it all off? Like, the point is, and I'm sorry if I'm seeking, if it sounds like I'm charged, I certainly don't wish to make fun of any member in this House for 1 minute. It's just that there's no credibility in adopting a position like that. And it affects then your credibility in doing the job that you actually have to do, which is to renegotiate. You reduce and undermine immediately from the word go your credibility and the perception of you as being somebody who's able to actually bring about an agreement and a renegotiation. So it's a credibility issue. And I have to say, and I have absolute respect to it, I agree with practically everything Deputy O'Sullivan said. I say that this notion that if we had only asked and we could like suck it and see and just see, it just is devoid of reality or devoid of credibility. The actions of this government will have to be assessed. And Deputy Clare made the point earlier on that the government will have to face the people, as indeed all the parties, including his own, will have to face the people at some point in the future. And we'll have to account for what we did or for what we didn't do. And look at what the actions of this government. We came to office at a time of unprecedented crisis. That's acknowledged. Near economic and financial collapse, if not absolute collapse. The private debts, as Deputy O'Sullivan says, absolutely correctly. The private debts of the failed banks and financial institutions have been lumbered onto the backs of the Irish people and have been transformed almost overnight into sovereign debt. One of the instruments, as we know, used to achieve this purpose was the promissory note or notes, which is, and I repeat this, it's a solemn sovereign promise by the Irish state. Now, when you listen to some speakers, in particular Sinn Féin, I must say, in the debate, you would think that all of this happened last week, that this promise was made last week. It did not. It happened in 2010. And it happened arguably as the inevitable consequence, clearly, of the profoundly mistaken blanket guarantee extended in 2008. That's how it happened. It didn't happen last week. Now, the new government was faced with this challenge, very onerous challenge in relation to probably the most onerous challenges ever faced by a sovereign Irish government, if indeed we accept that we were still sovereign at all when we came to office. Both of the parties that formed the new government had undertaken to renegotiate the debt. Neither of the parties, and clearly this point has to be made again, and Deputy Martin has a habit of talking about the Labour Party and Fine Gael Party as having somehow promised to default, or to burn the bondholders and to default. This was never a position of either party, as I understand, prior to the election. It certainly wasn't the position of my party. Others can speak for themselves. We always spoke about renegotiation. We never said we would repudiate sovereign commitments made on our behalf, much as we regard them as odious and outrageous in all of the descriptions that have been visited upon this catastrophe that we had to deal with. But we were coming into office as a government, and Sinn Féin know, I mean, they've been sitting in the Stormont government now for a number of years, and they know that when a minister in a government makes a legal agreement on behalf of the government, that he or she binds his successors. A new minister comes in, doesn't get to start all over again. They know that. They know that when a sovereign Irish government makes a commitment on the part of the people of Ireland, the Irish state, that it binds the successors of that government. This is fairly basic, and it is known to Sinn Féin as it is known to the rest of us. That doesn't mean, of course, that we didn't have a responsibility to seek to renegotiate and to achieve a better deal, and that is in fact what we did. And Deputy Daly talks about celebration. I'm not in celebratory mode. God knows there's little enough reason to celebrate in these situations. But I think if anybody, if just to be reasonable, and just to acknowledge that this arrangement last week is a considerable improvement on what was there before. Could people not even just do that? That it represents a considerable improvement. And, you know, we can quote the various commentators, and Deputy Wallace quoted one the other day, but he didn't quote the bit at the start of that man from the IMF's article, where he in fact was saying that it was, you know, the task ahead remained daunting, but that it was important, it was important achievement, and that Ireland would benefit from this and would benefit from the reprieve that it represents. So the question is, when we come to assessing what has been achieved, we have to ask whether this government has achieved a good outcome in the context of the facts and the circumstances with which it was faced. That is the question that has to be asked. Not why the government didn't seek to unwind or roll back on commitments made on behalf of the state, because that wasn't, frankly, available to it to do. And Deputy Culreevy knows that as good as anybody else. I'll just say finally that when parties do go to the people, I hope to God, if it is the case, for example, that Sinn Féin managed to garner more support in the community and get more seats or whatever else it is, I care more about the country, genuinely, than I do about the prospects for any political party, including my own. But if his party and Deputy Adams' party come to power in any circumstance, I hope to God that they put together some sort of policies and some sort of credible economic financial policies that can actually sustain this country to the future, because at the moment they're devoid of credibility.
Thank you, Minister. I now call on Deputy Liam Toomey.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm sure there's many members of the House often wonder when they sit on this side of the House listening to the contributions coming from the opposition and thought about what it would be like if maybe Deputy Ming Flanning was the Minister for Finance and Matthew McGrath was his Minister for State, and what would be the catastrophe of the reality if all that rhetoric was to become the reality. I don't actually think that Sinn Féin is that financially illiterate on some of the stuff that they sort of spout on the national media and any other time they get to talk about it. I don't think that they're incapable of understanding what is actually happening. I think it's just the usual story of playing politics with what is people's fears and anger about what is happening in this country. To talk about crocodile tears that I've heard this morning from members of the opposition, who instead want to play Russian roulette with people's lives and see what would happen if we default, just to see what will happen. Will social welfare get cut by 25%? Will teachers' pay and nurses' pay get cut by 25%? I should put a bullet in the chamber and see what happens. That sort of nonsense. I really don't believe they believe a minute of it. Unless, of course, and I think some members of Sinn Féin suffer from this as well, they're kind of stuck in a time warp of ideology. A time warp of ideology that kind of, that they hark back to the days of, 5-year planning from the Soviet Union. But we saw where that experiment went. It kind of disappeared. Unless, of course, North Korea is your new sort of poster boy for how we should actually run a modern economy like Ireland's. And it has been pure lies that, to some degree, has been said about what's happened here. We're stuck with a contractual obligation with what the promissory note is. It's not that it is toxic debt that comes from all your speeches that were written for you. It is a contract that was written into a sovereign government of this people, which was the last government, and we're stuck with it. And no amount of spinning it around changes that. And if we didn't pay it, it was a default. And it's as simple as that. And what has been negotiated now is creating a space so that we can actually get out of this mess that we're in at this moment in time, where our economy is still very fragile and still needs a lot of help to get out of. And now, I still don't understand why you're so mad keen to pay it back over the next 8 years. You feel that this is such a bad deal. We should pay it back. Maybe you don't know. So instead you want to default, but I don't think you actually quite know. Either way, this was not going to work for the people of Ireland. We have to create this space. We have to create that confidence so that people can actually get back to working in this country. And that is the focus here. You talk about the former Anglo-Irish Bank workers. There are a huge number of people out there whose jobs are very precarious at this moment in time. There's a huge number of people out there who are very worried about their jobs. And everything about government policy in the last 2 years is about helping to give that support. I was a member of this House in December 2010, and I remember that very picture image of A.J. Chopra crossing from the Berrien Hotel to government buildings. That was the picture of us losing our economic sovereignty. But it was so bad at that period of time that people were actually relieved, visibly relieved, to see the IMF coming in and taking over their economy. That's how concerned they were about this country. And there has been Trojan work done, restoring our image internationally and across Europe. I've just spent 3 days in Paris at the OECD conference about banking and financial systems. And all the countries in Europe, and even internationally, have recognised what we've done for ourselves. And we know that austerity is miserable, and we know it's tough on people, and we know we need to get out of it, but it can always get worse. And if there's one thing I would not vote for this government, is to play Russian roulette with people's lives. We have to watch every decision we make because it can so easily damage our economy here within this country and so easily damage our international reputation, which we have just about restored. And that's why we are getting such good direct foreign investment into this country. That's why we're now able to borrow again soon on the international markets. And it does actually amaze me, when I was a member of this House in December 2010, when IMF came in here, that there is that possibility that by the time we get to next December, we'll be on the verge of actually exiting this programme. And that is an unbelievable achievement when you also consider this is done in the background of trying to maintain educational services, trying to maintain health services, restoring the minimum wage, taking 300 people out of the universal social contribution net. When you think that we've managed to do that much, it has been an unbelievable achievement. Now, I don't for a minute expect Sinn Féin and the technical group want to give us any credit for that. And I suppose if there was any criticism that was to be made of this government, is that we're doing government very well. We're just not playing the politics very well, like some members of our opposition are doing. I had Deputy Ming Flanagan on my local radio station on Friday, and the guy is either economically illiterate or was actually playing politics. He was literally making it up as he goes along, and he didn't like the idea of being corrected either. And I'm sure the same is going for other deputies right on the government benches right across Ireland, when we have Sinn Féin representatives given a free-for-all on radio and some of the members, the other members of the opposition. And I think maybe it is a need for us to get out there and sell what we're actually doing an awful lot stronger than we're doing. This government has worked unbelievably well, considering the crisis that this country was in, considering the fragility of our economic situation still, and considering that we still have a good road to travel yet before we get ourselves back to where we were. But I think that there is a need for a bit more honesty, and in fact there may be a need for the media to explain that there's a need for a bit more honesty. Overall, this was a good deal for Ireland. It has created a space for us to come out of this crisis, and I wish the government every support, every bit of luck and support for the future years.
Thank you, Deputy. I now call on Deputy Owen Murphy.
Thank you, Chair. Agreements entered into must be honoured. Pacta sunt servanda. It's an incredibly important tenet of international relations, and we are an island and we do exist in the world. And much of what we do depends on our partners, both in that world, but in particular in the European Union and in the Eurozone, since that arrangement came into force. This is a welcome deal. And it is a deal, and it's important to recognise that. It was a negotiation between parties. And whenever there's a negotiation taking place, that involves compromise. And what that means when one compromises, they don't get exactly what they want. It's never going to be perfect. But we should recognise with this deal that was achieved by the government that it is the best possible outcome that could have been achieved in those negotiations. And those advocating a zero-sum approach, putting the gun on the barrel, Russian roulette, as Deputy Toomey was referring to, those advocating a zero-sum approach with our international partners will hopefully now recognise the folly of that type of approach. Because although high stakes and tough talking might sound good, when it comes to the wealth of the nation, and I don't just mean the financial wealth, but when it comes to its factors of production, its land, its labour, its capital, its enterprise, when it comes to those things, the risks are just too high, and the supposed benefits are too uncertain to take that kind of a gamble. I think the government should be congratulated for the strategy that it has adopted and for seeing that strategy through successfully, quietly and with determination, and ignoring the criticisms that were constantly levelled at it over the 2 years, both inside this chamber and outside. We went out to improve Ireland's reputation abroad, to increase foreign investment in the country, to commit ourselves wholly to the corrective measures that needed to be taken, to stabilise the economy, and to drive bond yields down so that others and the European Central Bank could have confidence in the country again and invest in Ireland again. This was the strategy, and in renegotiating the promissory notes last week, as the government did, we have shown that strategy has worked. And I think it's important that we recognise that. And it's not about putting on happy faces or gloating or anything like that, but recognising a good deal when it does come. The deal will not solve all of our problems, as we know, but the benefits should be recognised. This will reduce our borrowing costs in the coming years. It will help to reduce general government debt. It will help us to find a pathway to making that debt more sustainable. And it will help with the deficit reductions that need to take place over the coming years. And it will help put us on surer footing as we do exit the bailout. They're positives and they should be acknowledged. I'm not saying that people shouldn't challenge the government. I'm not an opponent of criticism where it is just. But we have to recognise that there is also a need for balance. Opponents of this government need to accept what is a good deal for this country, recognise that, and move on. This isn't about deference for deference sake, as the Taoiseach has said before, I mean, that age has passed, and he is correct in that. But there is a need for balance and for common sense, and when there is a good outcome for the country in important negotiations, to see that and to welcome it, and then to move on. Because there is a lot more for us to deal with. And this deal does not change the financial imperative that we have to correct the imbalance in our national finances and reduce the deficit as quickly as possible. That challenge has not gone away. We're still spending too much. We have to reduce that. We're still spending some of our money in the wrong way. We need to reform. That is what we have to do, and we have to do that quickly. And this deal will help us do that quickly. And it will help us do it in a better and a more sustainable way. So we should recognise that also. And we must absolutely take caution in returning to the giveaway mentality of the past, of trying to buy support from constituent elements of the population by either shouting a cause where there is none, or worse, by promising money where there is none. The times today require greater responsibility than that, and that needs to be recognised also. Of course, people are facing difficulties, and of course there are those who do need the help of the state. But some element of trust also has to be returned to politics. People need to trust their politicians again, and they need to trust the economic strategy that this government is undertaking, because so far it is working, and that too needs to be recognised. Cutting the deficit, reforming the government purse, growing the economy, and at every point of that growth, trying to facilitate job creation where we can. That's the great structural problem in the economy today, unemployment. That's what we need to fix, and this deal will help us in addressing that huge problem that we face. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I now call on Deputy Jim Daly.
Gormargad, Ecahirlock, and the fall team, Sikadad fall team, and Dish, Lord, Aaron Over, Talk to Shaw. Tom, Anavradul, Ecahirlock, Vemar Huid, Den Realtish, Arawanan, and Billisha, a Hur, Oscor, Tehina, Raktish. Nidolam, Ecahirlig, Gunenik, Misha, Darud, Riav, Aaron Law, Starul Shin, and Derdin Shikata, Norhanig, and Tishukaks, and Tanishta, Agus na Harry, Ishtach, Osar Gore, Agus a Karna Pointy, a Tassa Villisha, Osar Gore. Niawan, Mahon Fain, a Lauream, Nurfal team, and Billisha, Ach Lauream, a son, Nagrina, Winter Ear Kirky, a Tawik make of Lino Hin. Chairman, it's not my own views and my own opinions, but I speak on behalf of the people who I'm honoured to represent down in West Cork when I welcome this bill here before the House. And knocking the doors in the town of Bandon last Saturday morning, it was very evident everywhere the relief that people had, the welcome that people had, and the genuine welcome for this development. It's not for any political gain. It's not for any benefit to the government or anything. They were just genuinely relieved to see Ireland, that dreadful face, turning the corner. But a good development, a positive development, because it gave those very people hope. Those people who are struggling, who are challenged financially, who find it very, very difficult. This was a good day for them, and they welcomed it without exception on the doors that I met last Saturday morning. Much has been made during this debate about this fantasy and fairy tale land of write-down of our debt. While these notional theories make for great fodder for opportunistic, oppositional-style politics, but for those of us who exist in the real world and the reality drags on, we have to embrace and welcome this development. The idea that some fairy godmother heading up the European Central Bank would wave her magic wand and wipe away billions of euros is an utter nonsense and farcical at the least. This government sought and received a mandate from the Irish people to go back to Europe and renegotiate this arrangement, which was going to cost the country €3.1 billion every year. The government has honoured that mandate, and I, for one, am extremely proud of this achievement. My pride and gratitude are not of a political nature, but rather based on the benefits that will accrue to this generation of hard-pressed citizens. Another notional theory that this is not our debt. Again, a fantasy proposed by opportunistic opposing politics. We cannot, nobody in this House has the ability or the luxury to rewrite history. We cannot do that, whatever powers are vested in us, and it would be necessary to rewrite history, to rewrite the terms of history, if we were to disown this debt and use that as a starting point. The decision, rightly or wrongly, was taken in a previous administration to save the banks. Now, I'm not qualified, or neither would I pretend to be, to judge that decision in its entirety. I think time is judging it and will be the ultimate judge of that. There's many different views on what should have been done, some with the benefit of hindsight, some without. And finally, Count Corliffe, and I've said it in this House before, the idea of a write-down is the very same as a default. And the idea that you would aspire to default is absolutely farcical. Default can never be and should never be an aspiration of anyone.
We're now, I understand that the Sinn Féin group are the next, but they're not here at the moment, so move the technical group up. Deputy Healy-Rae.
Thank you very much, Count Caller. And I want to thank
20 minutes between three of you.
Yeah, I want to
sharing time with Tom Fleming and Matthew McGrath.
Yeah, that's right. It's down to two, Count Caller, because Deputy McGrath is not going to be here, I believe. No, so we'll just work between ourselves. Yeah. So at the outset, I'd like to thank sincerely the technical group for allowing me some of their time. Mr. Fintan O'Toole recently wrote an article, the heading of which was, "The debt deal is normalising the Irish freak show." He started off by stating the following: "There is an old story of the 18th century French Lothario sitting at a dinner beside a famously virtuous lady. 'Will you sleep with me?' he asks. 'Certainly not,' she said. 'How dare you suggest such a thing? Let us suppose, then, that I am the King of France, and I offered half of the kingdom for one night with you. Would you agree?' 'Well, perhaps, but you are not the King of France.' 'Very well, then, we have agreed the principle, so all that remains to be negotiated is the terms.' And so it was with Ireland's promissory notes. Once any semblance of moral principles had been abandoned, all that was left was to negotiate the terms of surrender, and again, we're all going to get screwed. The government has done their best over the last number of days to convince the Irish people that this is a great deal. It is not a great deal. The gambling debts of others have now been firmly placed on the shoulders of not just ourselves, but our children and our grandchildren. This government never actively sought a write-down of the burden of debt placed upon us. And an amazing statistic is that our very small economy has to bear a staggering 43% of the entire cost of the European Union bank bailout. Every Irish citizen has to put up €9,000, whereas the average European citizen has to fork out €191. People supporting this government have stood up in this House in the last number of days, blowing about the saving of 20 billion. This is not true, but that figure has been continuously put out by the government. The figure is actually 8 billion. And I am not trying to say that this is a small sum of money, but the bottom line is that the hard-pressed taxpayers of this country will be still paying 2/3 of the cost of the promissory notes without reducing the capital sum, which in my opinion we did not owe in the first instance. I again quote Mr. Fintan O'Toole, who, by the way, is a respectable national journalist, who does not have to engage in bullying tactics and does not have to resort to name-calling or derogatory comments about people to earn his living. And it is good to see a national journalist that doesn't have to scrape the bottom of the barrel to earn a living every week. He stated, Mr. Michael Noonan is now the daddy, of course. He has carried off with great aplomb the very act of normalising the freak show. The promissory notes were a monstrous freak, the star exhibit in the gallery of grotesques that is the Irish bank bailout. Its one virtue was in being so obviously freakish. The extortion of more than 30 billion from 1.8 million workers to pay entirely private debts is right up there with the Elephant Man and the Lobster Boy. Roll up, roll up. What last week's deal was all about was grand theft on an almost unimaginable scale, and it has now been transformed into plain old boring fact. I wish to remind this House that Minister Leo Varadkar insisted before the general election, and I quote, Anglo-Irish Bank is not getting another cent of our money, not another cent. He can tell that to his grandchildren. The public are not fooled by the government's spin. But what they do know is they will give decades working to see their hard-earned money leaving the country to pay for something that they never had a hand, act or part in incurring the debt in the first instance. This is a shame, and no matter how much spin the government puts on it, nothing will ever get away from this fact. And it may not be this month or next month. It may be a long time. But the people who applauded in this chamber for this deal will eventually rue the day that they did so. But as always, they are perfectly entitled to their opinion on the matter. Today, if the vote does take place, it probably will be the last time that there will be a vote on converting Ireland's bank debt into sovereign debt. The Cabinet did not seek at any time any burden sharing of the 30 billion with the other Eurozone members. Why? Why not even try? At the time of the issue of the promissory notes in 2010, all functioning Irish banks were already protected by the state's guarantee. Irish deposits in Anglo-Irish Bank and in the IRBC could have been protected for a fraction of the 30.6 billion promissory notes costs. All 22.5 billion of senior debt in Anglo-Irish Bank and IRBC have or will shortly be paid in full. There is an irrefutable case for the burden of 30.6 billion to be shared with other Eurozone members who are the beneficiaries of the promissory notes via the stabilisation of their banks. A promissory note one day, sovereign debt the next day. The government can call it what they like. But as Fintan O'Toole would say, once a freak show, always a freak show. I would certainly have concerns for the fact that children who aren't yet born will be paying this massive burden of debt, something that they had nothing to do with, something that they nor their parents didn't incur the debt in the first instance. And I think it is a shame. And I'd be the first person to compliment a government if I thought they were doing the right thing. And I would be the first to praise ministers if I thought they were doing the right thing. But unfortunately, in this instance, I do not think so, I do not agree so, and many others don't either. But at the end of the day, we are where we are. The government have their majority, and of course, whatever their views or opinions on any matter are, that's what will be pushed through in this Dáil. So with that, Ceann Comhairle, I thank you very, very much.
Ceann Comhairle, is there much time left, Ceann Comhairle?
Oh, just 12 minutes.
Yeah. Well, on the much awaited deal on the promissory notes, which certainly gives us a restricted breathing space for economic growth and hopefully a break from the crippling austerity measures of the last 5 to 6 years, it still leaves this country with a mountain to climb. That is the positive side of this long-running saga, but the reality is we will not even begin to pay off the principal on the new bonds until 2038, and then continuing the principal payments until 2053. Thereby burdening coming generations. The promissory note payment plus the interest comes then to a total of 48 billion, which is a stupendous figure. It certainly does not get us off the hook. We still have a colossal debt, and to put it in context, our national debt is in total in the region of up to 190 billion. There was a grave error in giving a blanket guarantee, which essentially was an open cheque on behalf of our citizens to the banks and their foreign bondholders. When any rational and ethical national political system would have definitely guaranteed all deposits, but would have made it clear at the time of the guarantee that it would negotiate with the bondholders, with the content of the negotiations being on the basis of our ability to paying some percentage of the bond values, whether they be subordinated or senior bonds. After all, the shareholders, many of whom were very small investors, and they were elderly people, and by and large they were pensioners, and they had small amounts of money invested at that particular time, to cover expenses in their old age. They had the value of their shares were practically wiped out. And as a result of this particular guarantee, the state was effectively shut out of the bonds market because the investors lost confidence in our ability to repay our debts, and they sought exorbitant interest rates. And the state had to seek help from the EU and the IMF to save us from economic meltdown in 2010. We all know the kind of supposed to be called so-called help that we got at that particular time, this 85 billion deal, a European package. There was many conditions attached, and it was carrying a penal 5.83% per interest rate at that particular time. And after some negotiation by this government, it was eventually reduced back down to something in the region of just over 3%. Even the Greeks at that particular time got a much better deal, and also there was a lot of question marks surrounding the accuracy of the data that was coming out from that particular country and about their economic situation. But there is a question here, I believe, regarding the quality of the deal, and I know that it was achieved in very adverse circumstances and a lot of intricate negotiating behind the scenes, and I certainly would give credit to everybody involved in a hard situation, you know. But I do believe because of the variable interest rates applied to it, we do not know what ultimately it will come to. If the interest rates, for instance, which determine everything in this, if the interest rates goes up, we will be, to put it mildly, we'll be screwed. At present, for instance, in Britain, the interest rates are 5%. Now, we're also well aware of the fact that historically and down through the years, there has been massive periods in world history where inflation was next to zero, for instance, and we're very dependent on low, particularly very low interest rates over the next 40 to 50, over the next. We are dependent that they will rise from the rates that they're at present to assist us along the way, and so. If we are depending on inflation to wipe out the capital sum that we eventually have to pay, this is really based on, we'll call it voodoo economics, and it is a case of live horse and you will get grass. And I do believe that we need to get out there and to review this matter and revisit it, and if we can achieve a zero interest rate, and with a payment time frame of maybe up to 90 to 100 years, if at all possible, and over a much longer period than what's agreed for. For instance, in Germany following World War I, there's an international precedent there. They were allowed an open-ended time frame to pay back the reparation monies to the Allies following that World War. And this payback was only finalised in the recent past, and therefore they had over 90 years, and which certainly was achievable over that particular amount of time. And I think we should be striving to perhaps renegotiate certain aspects of it. And well, the other matter there is we got some price platitudes a few months back from the EU and the EU leaders in particular, and where they did regard this as a special case, and they said that Ireland certainly would have to be treated in a unique fashion. And I think that they really put us through the ropes, and I don't think they acknowledge fully their statements prior to that. And I do believe that there is a great case to be made for a certain amount of a debt write-down, and certainly their actions to assist promptly and cooperate and address our dire situation was prolonged and cumbersome to say the least. The IMF on the 19th December last, they warned that Ireland's economy could stagnate, leaving the country in a distressed state for years to come. And it warned the EU that it must help to cut the burden of our bank debt and to give a strong signal to the ECB to act decisively and also assist with the 31 billion promissory notes as such. Now, action has been carried out in that. But they also mentioned regarding the amount of money is over 30 billion for the two pillar banks, for the, we'll call them the good banks, for instance. And I would like to say that it's good to see, it's good riddance anyway to the old Anglo-Irish Bank, and I think there's nobody mourning over the fact, or I think that people are really glad to see the back of it. And but the other matter is, I do believe that the Christine Lagarde and the IMF did give an indication that perhaps they would assist in would also give us some reprieve for the two pillar banks, namely Bank of Ireland and Irish. And I think perhaps we can maybe go back and really renegotiate some matters regarding that aspect as well. Now, the other thing here is there's also a matter out there regarding the IMF, where they have indicated that the Merkel-Sarkozy axis, they focus very much on debt reduction through austerity and increasing competitiveness as the most effective way of combating the crisis. But in October last year, they concluded eventually that it might have got its basic economics wrong, and admitted and conceded that the austerity does not work, and not only does it not work, but it is counterproductive. And Ms. Lagarde at the time also realised that its economics model was wrong, and it implies that the fiscal compact we signed up to will actually, in time, will destroy Europe's economy. And the fact of the matter is the austerity budgets, as where we've arrived at the moment, the tough budgets are here to stay for some time. And because of 1 billion in savings of this deal, will be paying off borrowing debt, for instance. And you know, the ordinary person out there in the street, as Jim Daly has remarked earlier, you know, they are asking questions, and what does it mean for themselves and their families and their futures? And basically, the whole reality here is that we're still going to be faced with severe measures over the next number of years. And I would hope here that the government would actually perhaps take up this case with the Troika in a more aggressive manner, and we will have to get some concessions for our citizens. At the moment, they're driven through the ground. There's draconian measures over the previous 6 years have really taken their toll all around, you know. And the other matter here is that's going to have a whole effect in this is that we will be striving to get the deficit below 3%, it seems, by 2015. But I think we have to have a balance here. People really have taken enough, and they are at this stage disillusioned, and I think we'll have to give a break to the ordinary general public out there, and we certainly will have to make their lives a bit easier, you know. And so, as it is, today there was launching of the Caritas Europa report, which is on the impact of the European crisis, and there is some interesting readings. This is just a brief synopsis of it, and I think it's certainly something very worrying for this particular country, you know, what's contained in it, and it just shows the huge efforts and the job that's ahead of us to bring our country back into shape and make us more solvent. It says the first, and I'll quote from somewhere here, is the first in-depth examination of the impact of austerity policies on people in the 5 EU countries worst affected by the economic crisis concludes that the policy of prioritising austerity is not working. Ireland, Greece, Italy, Portugal and Spain are the focus of the Caritas Europa study entitled The Impact of the European Crisis. Using statistics, the report highlights historically high levels of unemployment in Europe, with more than 10% of the labour workforce out of work. And it points to children being at a greater risk of poverty or social exclusion than the rest of the population in 21 of these 25 member states, which we are amongst that 21. And the study strongly challenges current official suggestions that the worst of the economic crisis is over. And it presents a picture of a Europe in which social risks are increasing, social systems are being tested, and individuals and families are under stress. And the report highlights the extremely negative impact austerity policies have on the lives of vulnerable people, and reveals that many others are being driven into poverty for the first time.